Qatar is about to hold a news conference as Israel and Hamas make a final push to seal a Gaza ceasefire in Doha. A Hamas official has told the BBC that it has told Qatari and Egyptian mediators that the group has approved the ceasefire agreement. It's hoped that deal will mean an agreement to stop the war in Gaza. It's also expected to see an exchange of hostages and prisoners. We'll bring you details of that deal when we get them. But let's speak now to the former First Minister, Humza, Yousaf, who's on the line. Mr. Yousaf, good evening to you. Thank you for coming on. It sounds imminent, doesn't it? How do you feel?
Well, I think this is just a bit of light in what has been an intensely dark period. I mean, hugely welcome news. And my wife, as you know, still has family in Gaza, and I can't imagine what they're feeling at the possible prospect. As you say, it sounds like it will be announced imminently from the Qataris, what they will be feeling in terms of just some relief, and hopefully this means aid being allowed to flood into Gaza that is so desperately needed.
And as you were saying, your wife's family is still there. What have you been hearing about conditions recently where they are?
I think we've kind of run out of words to describe how horrific and inhumane the situation is. You will hear regularly from UN officials or those who are working for humanitarian organisations, some who've worked for these organisations for decades, and they will say that Gaza is incomparable. It is like nothing else they have seen before. You're talking about 96%, virtually the whole population, suffering from malnutrition. You're talking about the vast majority of 3/4 of the critical water infrastructure completely decimated. You are talking about children, families huddled in tents. We know in the first 7 days alone of 2025, 74 children were killed. Many of them died from hypothermia. So this is a situation, we talk about hell on earth. This seems even worse than that. So beyond imaginable. So therefore, I think the reaction from the people of Gaza, certainly that I've heard from over the last kind of 24 hours when news of a possible ceasefire deal has been in the media, that they are just desperate for that to be confirmed.
It must be so hard because there has been flashes of hope previously, hasn't there? And we've seen to have been close to a ceasefire deal. This sounds as though it's it. So it must be such an incredible roller coaster of emotions for them, thinking perhaps there had been a deal when it turned out that there hadn't been one. I can't imagine what that must be like.
For them, and look, also, let's not forget for the families, the Israeli families who have loved ones that have been kept hostage, those hostages that are still alive. What a emotional roller coaster and turmoil and grief that they must have been going through over these last 15 months. So there's a whole number of people, primarily, yes, in Gaza, some families, of course, in Israel, who are waiting for their loved ones to come back home. And look, I'm reticent in some respects to stray into too much into the politics, given the focus should be on the humanitarian and the flood of aid that needs to come into Gaza. But it also fills me with a great level and amount of anger when an Israeli senior minister, Ben Gvir, who is by all accounts an extremist in the government, saying that he takes great pride in the fact that he's blocked every ceasefire deal that's come on the table in the last year. And one does have to wonder, did it have to take 47,000 at least Gazans to die? Did it have to take tens of thousands of children to die, tens of thousands of women to die, hospitals to be destroyed, schools to be destroyed, refugee camps to be bombed? Did it have to take all of that human suffering and misery to finally get to a ceasefire? And of course, ultimately, the question on everybody's mind will be, and the hope I think that everybody will have in their hearts, is, can we make this a permanent ceasefire deal for the people of Gaza, and indeed so the people of Israel can live in peace and security? And
how hopeful are you that this deal can hold? I know I was speaking to a negotiation expert yesterday who described it as fragile, and that's the worry, isn't it? Do you have hope that this will be a permanent ceasefire?
Not a terrible amount of hope. I'm in the same place as the negotiator that you're talking about. I think it's very fragile. I think the worry a lot of us have, and perhaps it's my years in politics that makes me particularly more sceptical about these matters. But the worry many of us have is that this is just a gift, either a parting gift or a gift for the incoming president-elect of the United States. And it may last a few days, it may last a week, as I say, as a gift to the incoming president, and then shatters, and we go back to a place where it's innocent people who suffer. And I think that is the point. It is innocent people in Gaza that have suffered the most. Those who have committed no crime. We know from a UN study last year that almost 70% of those killed have been women and children. They have nothing to do with Hamas, nothing to do with October the 7th, 2023. So, look, I'm not filled with a huge amount of hope. Let's take every almost hour as it comes. But the immediate priority, once this ceasefire deal is hopefully announced, is to flood Gaza with aid. There can be no restriction. There can be no holding back. There should be whatever security checks have been agreed as part of the ceasefire deal, of course, but we need Gaza to be flooded with aid to help the people that have suffered immensely over the last 15 months.
And what in particular does it need? I think we're going to be speaking to Margaret Harris, possibly from the World Health Organization, who said she's never seen conditions like it her whole time working in the humanitarian aid field. What is absolutely vital for Gaza at this point?
Well, that message from Margaret is the exact message I hear from every single aid worker. Some of them have worked 3 to 4 decades in international development, in emergency humanitarian aid, and they've never seen the level of destruction that we're witnessing in Gaza. Look, it is the most basic. People are starving to death and freezing to death. So we have to make sure, and disease and death is inescapable in Gaza at the moment. So the most basic fundamental needs, we need to rebuild the water infrastructure. We need to, of course, give people safety and security in a watertight living quarters. They need the most basic in terms of medicine and food. That is what they need. And it's not hundreds, it's thousands of tons a day that are going to have to flood into Gaza, and that is not going to be resolved over a few days, hence why the ceasefire has to be a long-lasting and permanent one, we hope. But there are a number of organisations who are ready, who have hundreds of trucks at the borders, and are desperately wanting to get access into Gaza. So let's hope that can happen. And as I say, let's hope those people who have suffered already tremendously over the last 15 months in Gaza, and of course the families of hostages, let's hope that they can perhaps sleep just a little bit easier when that ceasefire is announced.
And Mr. Yousaf, I'm going to speak very shortly to a young Scottish Israeli woman who's in Tel Aviv. One parent's Scottish, one parent is Israeli. She's had to hide in bomb shelters. I spoke to her last night. I'm going to speak to her again now the deal has been, it seems to have happened. She said that people on both sides, what they want is just to be safe, just to go about their daily life safe for them and their families. And sometimes that's forgotten, isn't it? The noise of the politics and etc. And there's both sides, ordinary people, that's just what they want.
Safety, and I think they just want equality, is the truth. And I have somebody I speak to with some regularity. I don't know if it's the same person in Tel Aviv, and she's been a peace advocate for many years. She's called for the end of occupation. She's called for a two-state solution, a Palestinian state alongside an Israeli state. And I think that's right. I think the vast majority of people in Israel, no doubt, and in Palestine, no doubt, want that. But at the root of it, at the heart of it, there has to be equality. It can't just be warm words about safety and security. We have to have equality. And look, the ceasefire deal is the absolute immediate step. It's what we need. And then we need to flood Gaza with aid. What then has to happen in the medium term? Well, there has to be accountability. And that's why the international law process is so important, accountability for the terrible crimes that have been committed. But ultimately, if we don't want this perpetual cycle of violence that you and I have witnessed over the decades to keep happening, there has to be real progress towards a two-state solution. And look, at my politics, it's fair to state the obvious, my politics differs a fair bit from Donald Trump's, I think it's fair to say. But he is an incoming president, and I hope that he will take the issue of long-term peace and security, frankly, far more seriously than I believe his predecessor and his predecessors have done thus far. So there has to be a longer-term solution, and that has to be rooted in equality, that a Palestinian life matters as much, no more, matters as much as an Israeli life, and therefore a Palestinian state must be created to sit safely and securely alongside an Israeli state.
I know you have to be away. Just one final question, Mr. Yousaf, if you don't mind. We've just had this US President-elect Donald Trump has just written on Truth Social, his social media platform, "We have a deal for the hostages in the Middle East. They will be released shortly. Thank you." Is this down to Donald Trump?
Look, I think he's a man that is known to want to do deals. He's a man that likes to take credit for doing deals. Frankly, I couldn't care less who takes the credit for this. So he's clearly had a role to play. I go back to my starting position, though. It would be an absolute injustice and a terrible shame, tragedy, in fact, if this ceasefire deal being announced today was simply a incoming gift to a new president and then dismantled and shattered after a few days or even after a week or two. So everything that can be done must be done to ensure that this is a permanent ceasefire, and ultimately the people of Gaza get the aid that they so desperately need to rebuild their shattered lives.
Just finally, will you and your family sleep better tonight, do you think, Mr. Yousaf?
I think so, and I don't think it's just me and my family. I mean, of course, Nadia has that personal family connection, but I have to tell you, I have been so moved over the last 15 months by people who have no connection to Palestine, to Gaza, but have been, just distraught. And I think that's the vast majority of us, distraught at the destruction that we've seen. I think you'd have to, you couldn't possibly be human not to feel a great sadness at the tragedy and the suffering that we've witnessed. So I hope everybody, whether you have a connection with Gaza or not, when the ceasefire deal is announced, can just sleep a little bit easier. But I think most of us will be doing that with one eye open, as it was, to see whether or not this ceasefire deal remains intact. And hopefully all of us hope it becomes a permanent ceasefire deal. You
sound quite emotional. It must be very emotional.
I think it's emotional for so many of us, as I say. I mean, I'm a father of three girls, as you know, and I always try to bring this back to children. They're just, for all the geopolitics, and I'm steeped in politics and had an interest in geopolitics all my life, but for all of the politics of this, ultimately it's horrendous to witness children freeze to death. We've watched it live streamed on our mobile phones, watched it on our televisions, and I keep thinking to myself, what if that was my daughter? And I think that's probably where we all need to start from. The politics of it, are complex. We all know that. But if we try to root our leadership in empathy and humanity, then maybe we wouldn't have half the problems we tend to do in the world.
I appreciate you coming on with us tonight. Thank you so much. That is the former First Minister Humza Yousaf speaking to us there. If you have just tuned in, you're listening to BBC Radio Scotland's Drive Time programme with me, Fiona Stoker. I suppose if you are listening, history is being made. Israel and Hamas have agreed a ceasefire deal. That reaction there from the former First Minister Humza Yousaf, his wife's family. Some of them do still live in Gaza. Her parents managed to get out at some point. That was him just giving his reaction. That's according, of course, the ceasefire deal. Two sources briefing the BBC. We are expecting a press conference shortly. Well, someone who I've spoken to throughout the conflict is young Scottish Israeli woman Danielle Bett. She works for a non-profit organisation and lives in Tel Aviv. Danielle, good to speak to you. Things have moved on since we spoke this time yesterday. How are you feeling tonight?
Yeah, I mean, we've been deprived of hope in this region for so long that it feels quite hard to let out a breath and feel relief. But it feels as though for the first time in a long time, we do have hope that something is going to change in the short-term future, at least.
Women and under-19s are reported as being released first. Are you hearing any more on that from where you are in Tel Aviv?
It's difficult to know because there's lots of rumors on the names and the people who are being released, and we obviously don't know who is and isn't alive, unfortunately, of the hostages. But yes, the rumors are that it's going to be women and people who are perhaps elderly or have medical conditions in the first phase. So we're hopeful we'll know more over the coming days.
And Danielle, I think you were listening there to Humza Yousaf, the former First Minister, giving his reaction. And, you know, obviously a very emotional time for so many people. But as we were saying there, it just gets back to the ordinary people on both sides who want to live safely and equally, which is something you've said all along.
Yeah, I've been lucky to be able to speak to Humza a few times over the past couple of years. So I really relate to everything that he said. I think that everything that we've watched has been a level of human suffering that many of us thought was unthinkable. And so I think that what needs to be the primary thing that people keep in mind when they think of the politics might be difficult, but it doesn't mean that things can't be changed and can't be solved if there is a will and if you keep the kind of humanity and the need for change at the heart of your message.
How hopeful are you that this ceasefire deal, which we think will be announced very shortly, a press conference is imminent, we're told, in Qatar. How hopeful are you that that will be something more permanent?
Unfortunately, I do share, again, Hamza's kind of lack of hope in the long term. I think that it's possible that because Trump has a different approach and perhaps a harsher approach than Biden to politics and to negotiations, he might be able to put more pressure on the Israeli government and beyond that on Hamas to keep the ceasefire. But it is a ceasefire in multiple stages, and so it's going to be a long run before we understand even if this current ceasefire holds, let alone anything more long term. And unfortunately, we do have leaders that have shown that they aren't putting human life and their own civilians at the priority of their strategy.
And in terms of how you and your family and neighbours and friends and colleagues are feeling about this, does this change, do you think, how they feel or not at all about the government's actions, the Israeli government's actions in getting the hostages released? Because I know you've said before there are many Israelis that don't agree with the stance that Benjamin Netanyahu has been taking. How do you feel?
I think actually more frustrated than ever, because if you look at this deal, this is pretty similar to the deal that was on the table earlier last year. Many hostages have been needlessly killed since, many Israelis and many, many more Palestinians have been killed for political reasons. And so there is no reason that this deal couldn't have happened sooner. And it's frustrating that the government, it's needed the intervention of Trump and the pressure from the international community to make this happen, when in fact we could have done this much sooner and saved so many more lives. And
is that how you feel that it has got over the line, which we think it has, because of President Trump's intervention?
It seems to be the case, yes. There's still, I mean, again, the vast majority of the Israeli public do support a deal, but that's not where Netanyahu takes his lead from. He takes his lead from his base supporters and from what will keep his government safe. He still has an element, the far-right extremists in his government, Ben Gvir and Smotrich, who are not entirely supportive of this deal and have threatened not to allow the full deal to go through or to collapse the government, even if part of the deal goes through. And so that's what's prevented him thus far from being able to negotiate a deal. And it seems to be the pressure that Trump has managed to put on has, and that's not to show any kind of applause or support for Trump, but he's managed to put pressure that hasn't been put on the past and to get this through.
And Danielle, how are the families of and friends of the hostages that look as though they are now going to be released feeling? How much coverage is that in the Israeli media? How are the hostages' families feeling?
I think that's the main real story for most Israelis and in the media is really the hope the hostage families have, but for a lot of them it's stress because we don't know with a lot of the hostages if they're alive and if they're well. Unlike the deal that we had last November, which, whilst it was still horrific that so many children and families were held for 50 plus days in Gaza, they survived it and they got out after 50 days and there was a big sense of hope and relief. Now we're talking about people who've been held in captivity for well over years in God knows what conditions and under what kind of treatment with Hamas being a terrorist organization. So I think there is a lot of hope and relief among families and friends, but also a real nervousness as to who's going to come back alive and what kind of state people are going to be in as well.
And tonight, I suppose the same question I was asking Humza, Yousaf, will you sleep better, do you think, when we get news of this ceasefire?
I think I'll sleep better once I see the hostages starting to come home and it's actually happening, because we've had too many false promises. So it's difficult to feel complete trust in those in power, unfortunately. And so when the deal actually happens and we start to see people coming home and we start to see aid flowing into Gaza, then I'll feel more hope and more ease that it's actually happening.
Danielle, thank you so much for coming back on with us tonight. That's young Scottish-Israeli woman Danielle Bett. She works for a non-profit organisation and lives in Tel Aviv.